Hi, I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Aaron Glantz. He's the author of How America Lost Iraq, now out in paperback. He's a reporter for Pacifica Radio, also writes for us at antiwar.com. And first of all, I want to talk a little bit about your book, How America Lost Iraq. In your book, you talk about how you, even though you opposed the war all along, you saw how actually the Iraqi people really were happy to be liberated from Saddam Hussein, even in his hometown and stuff like that. You talk about in your book how there really was a window of opportunity to do something right by these people here, even if the invasion was wrong, and yet somehow we blew it anyway.
When I went to Iraq for the first time in 2003 after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, I wanted to talk to as many different kinds of Iraqi people as possible, and it didn't matter whether I went to Fallujah or Baghdad or in the south of Iraq or in the north of Iraq. Almost everyone I talked to was relieved that after 35 years of Ba'athist dictatorship, Saddam Hussein was finally gone. Now, this did not mean that people were happy at the current situation. They were frustrated that they had no electricity, frustrated that they had no clean water, frustrated that America had bombed the telephone grid and so they couldn't find out what was going on with their families, frustrating at the looting, frustrated at the fact that the Americans protect the oil ministry and very little else. But, still, almost everyone you talked to had a personal horror story of one of their relatives being imprisoned or killed by Saddam Hussein. And so almost everyone I talked to was pretty happy for the change.
Now, there's been a lot of news lately. In Kurdistan, seems there were reports a couple of weeks back that this terrorist group, the PKK, has been blowing up targets in Turkey, and now you wrote in your article for antiwar.com that the Turks have lined up 250,000 soldiers near the Iraqi border. Is that right?
Well, to say that they've lined up the troops, 250,000 on the Iraqi border is a bit of an overstatement. Of course, Turkey has been fighting a low-level war, sometimes a high-level war against Kurdish separatists in the southeast for about 25 years now. This is because Kurds in Turkey have no civil rights. If their imam wants to preach their sermon in Kurdish, it's not allowed. If they want to talk on the radio in Kurdish, it's not allowed. If they want to teach their children Kurdish in school, it's not allowed. Even if a teacher who's teaching Kurdish children Turkish cannot even say, well, this word in Turkish is similar to this word in Kurdish, that is also not allowed. And so Kurds in Turkey have been fighting against this for years, and there had been a ceasefire since 1999 after Turkey captured one of the rebel leaders. But recently the PKK, which is now goes by a different name called Congregel, recently they decided that they were going to start fighting again, and so Turkey has increased their military presence in the southeast. In addition to that, there are approximately 5,000 of these PKK fighters who are actually in Iraq under the protection of the Kurdish authorities in Iraq, and Turkey has been threatening to bring that very large army. Of course, Turkey has an army of 1 million troops to engage that army against Kurdish rebels that are in northern Iraq.
Well, now that's a very complicated situation because, first of all, America's been helping the Turks suppress their Kurds for the last 25 years, right?
That's right.
And now we've basically been allied. The Kurds have been our closest allies in Iraq ever since 1991. And there's Kurds also in Iran and in Syria as well. So what do you make of all the pressure for Kurdish separatism? Do you think that they're going to stay part of Iraq, or are they going to break off? Because that would be a sure thing to get those Turkish troops on the other side of that border.
Well, first of all, I want to elaborate. The United States has not just been verbally supporting Turkey. We sell them a lot of guns. We sell them F-15, F-16 fighter jets, which they use to bomb Kurdish villages in Turkey. And so we sell them a lot of other ground equipment as well to oppress their own Kurds. But the dynamics in between Turkey and Iraq, and also between Turkey and Iran and Syria, where there are also large Kurdish populations. Turkey has a lot of options besides just military force. When I was in Iraqi Kurdistan last year, there was a strike by Turkish truckers. Now, these truckers were refusing to carry oil. Of course, you know, the Iraqi oil facilities have been down a lot because of the violence in Iraq, and so they're getting a lot of their oil from refineries in Turkey to run their cars. And the Turkish truckers went on strike because it's so violent they wanted to raise. And just this strike by Turkish truckers paralyzed the economy of northern Iraq and basically made gasoline disappear overnight. Now, this is just a labor action. Imagine if the government of Turkey decided to close the border. They could paralyze not only northern Iraq, but all of Iraq, because the borders from Jordan and Syria are, of course, extremely dangerous, and no trucker in their right mind would bring anything across those borders. The border from Iran, of course, we have all the rhetoric between Washington and Iran. It becomes very difficult to deal with Iran in any kind of business, economic way in this situation, plus Iran lacks the resources from the West that Turkey has. And so it all adds up to a very powerful non-military role for Turkey in the region as well.
I read the news this morning that, I guess just this last week, that the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Democratic Party have finally merged their government. I guess their parliament had been merged, but now they've finally merged their executive branches of government together into a unity government. And the article that I read, I believe in the Independent, was saying that the question really was, is this a move towards separatism, or are we to believe Talabani and Barzani when they say that what they're really trying to do here is just strengthen the new central government of Iraq and that they're Iraqi nationalists after all?
Well,
and is one choice better than the other in either of those cases?
Well, the Kurdish political parties are playing a double game. The parties that you mentioned, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Democratic Party, they are not parties like the Democrats and the Republicans in America. They are institutions that have armies and control ministries in northern Iraq. And half of that area between the Syrian border and down to Erbil is controlled by the KDP and their militia. And the other area kind of along the Iranian border down to Halabja, that is controlled by the PUK and their militia. Now basically what they're saying is they're merging their militias into one big militia that's going to be under the control of Masoud Barzani, who's the leader of one of the factions, whereas the other guy, the leader of the other faction, Jalal Talabani, is going to Baghdad to be the president of Iraq. So on one level, it doesn't really matter what they do in terms of merging their governments. It's a kind of a local government issue, the way people deal with their neighbors. But on another level, these parties are really playing a double game, because when I was there in January of 2005 for the elections, even though the parties were saying publicly that they favor federalism within Iraq, they were sending out people who I interviewed to gather signatures with the idea of getting millions of signatures, which they did do, to push for a referendum on separatism. So they were paying signature gatherers for a referendum on separatism. At the same time, they were saying they were against separatism during the campaign. And this is because most Kurds favor separatism. I mean, just everyday people on the street. They think that they deserve their own country, just like any other people in the world.
I read an article in the Washington Post, I guess probably in January or February, a couple of months back, about the Kurdish Peshmergas and interviews with some of these guys inside the Iraqi army, saying, oh, we're ready at a moment's notice to kill our Arab commanders and secede at the drop of a hat. We have no love for our Arab Iraqi brothers whatsoever. We're Kurds.
Well, you know, in the 2004 siege of Fallujah, which I report on in the book, one of the things that happened was that all of the Arabs in the Iraqi army refused to fight. And they put down their arms and they walked away from the Americans. They said, we won't fight in this bloody siege where you're killing so many people that the municipal football stadium of Fallujah is being turned into a graveyard for the dead. We won't fight. And in fact, 10% of them mutinied and fought against the American army. But the Kurds were more than happy to fight. against the people of Fallujah. And this left the people of Fallujah feeling like there was already a civil war going on, that the Americans were taking Kurds from the north and having them fight Arabs in the south. Now, the same thing is going on now in Mosul, which is a primarily Arab city in the northwest of Iraq. The problem is that the Americans cannot find Iraqis willing to fight in Mosul against other Iraqis. They cannot find Iraqi Arabs willing to do this. So instead what they're doing is they're getting the Kurdish Peshmerga to do the fighting for them. And this is bad news. I confronted, when I was in Erbil, the seat of government of Iraqi Kurdistan, I confronted the local governor about this, and I said, listen, you say you want your independence. You say you want your autonomy and federalism from the rest of the people of Iraq, but how are the Arabs supposed to be feeling when you're going to fight the Americans' dirty work for them against the Arabs? If you want independence, why don't you stay within your area? And they said to me, we have such a big debt to the Americans for overthrowing Saddam that we're more than happy to do whatever they ask us to do.
Well, and lost in all this, too, is the Turkmen. Which cities are they predominantly? I remember in Tal Afar, there was a question, that was, I think, one of the ones that Bush said was a great success story, was the city of Tal Afar, where it was, again, Turkmen versus Arabs versus Kurds and the American army in there somewhere, and it really always breaks down along those ethnic lines, right?
Well, Tal Afar is a unique city in Iraq in that it's a majority Turkish ethnic city. There's also a large Turkish community in Kirkuk, which is where the oil is in northern Iraq. But Tal Afar is unique in that it's neither a majority Kurd or Arab city. But to say that it's a success story is really well beyond reality. The U.S. military killed so many people when they bombed Tal Afar that the Turkish government threatened to throw the U.S. military out of their bases in Turkey if they continued to bomb, because most of the people being killed were ethnic Turks who were innocent civilians. This is a normal state of affairs in Iraq. There's some kind of terrorist hiding out somewhere, and the only thing that the Bush administration can think to do is to flatten the city. And of course the Turkish people who are living there, they're reporting that they're being terrorized by these Arab terrorists, kind of Al-Qaeda types, fundamentalist types. The city had been taken over by the fundamentalists, and that they couldn't do things that they used to do, like go to work and go to school, because of these terrorist fundamentalists. But the only thing that Bush could think to do about this situation was to bomb the city, and Turkey objected to that. And so, and then they threatened to kick the U.S. military out of Turkey, where we have a very important air base at Incirlik. And this happened about a year ago. Tal Afar is less important politically speaking than Kirkuk, because there's a tremendous amount of oil there, and the Turkmen population is maybe about a third of the population of the city. And no doubt the Turkish military and the Turkish government, I always say when they pretend they need to protect the Turkmen population of Kirkuk, what they're really saying is we want to keep the Kurds from declaring independence, because frankly, I've talked to a lot of Turkmen in Kirkuk, and they really don't care, shop owners. They're really, a lot of them are in kind of the small business class. They own corner stores and such, and they say, we don't care whether we're in Iraq, we don't care whether we're in Kurdistan, we just want peace, and we want to be able to do our business and trade with our neighbors. But the Turkish military and the Turkish government has an interest in the Kurds not seizing Kirkuk, and so they will claim that they need to intervene to protect the Turkmen there. But the Kurds are not threatening the Turkmen at all, although the Kurds are very much fighting against Arab peoples there frequently.
Yeah, and we've read quite a bit about ethnic cleansing in Kirkuk, although it's been, I guess, a year and a half or 2 years since we first started hearing about this. It seems like if it's going full speed, it's either done by now or...
They want to seize this city, and also you have to remember that during the Ansal campaign in the 80s, when Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds at Halabja, he also forced a tremendous number of them to leave this area because it does have oil. And now a lot of these folks, now they have children as well, and their families are bigger, and they want to come back. And, rather than coming up with some kind of situation where these people get to return out of their refugee camps where they've been living for 15 years in the far north of Iraq, rather than coming up with some accommodation to build additional housing for them, the Kurdish parties are insistent that the Arabs who were forcibly moved there from the south by Saddam Hussein, that they be forced to leave and go back to what the Kurds call their original place. But of course now you have the second, third generation sometimes of people who were moved up, and they don't want to leave. They were born there. That's their home. And because the situation is so explosive, the actions on the ground have not yet matched the rhetoric of the Kurdish political factions, because a lot of this stuff is being settled at the bargaining table in Baghdad, and a lot of the machinations that you were asking me about before with Talabani and Barzani and merging and stuff like this, and a lot of the fight over Ibrahim al-Jafari and the fact that America did not want him to continue as the prime minister, and neither did the Kurds. A lot of that has to do with who gets to live in Kirkuk. And I should say that Kirkuk is not a very beautiful city. I've been to Kirkuk, many times, and it's really, it has the river running through it, and, some nice bridges and a few nice restaurants. But compared to many other cities in Iraq, it is really just kind of a podunk nowhere town, except that it happens to be sitting on top of, a tremendous amount of oil. So when the Kurds say, well, this is our ancestral homeland, it is nowhere near as beautiful or wonderful as Suleimaniya or Halabja or Zaho or any of the number of gorgeous cities in Kurdistan, but it does have the oil.
Yeah, I think it was Barzani who said, hey, this is our Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think that it's not really their Jerusalem at all. You have a history of Kirkuk. It's the city that's on the edge of where Kurds have historically lived. It's the farthest south that Kurds have historically lived. And Saddam did indeed perpetrate a tremendous wrong against them, a genocide, by killing and displacing 100,000 Kurds. But it was never the heart of Kurdistan at all. The heart of Kurdistan is probably Diyarbakir, which is in Turkey. Like 4 hours drive to the north.
So Kirkuk's more like a Remember the Alamo kind of thing.
Yeah, or it's kind of a boom town, frontier boom town. Because also, unlike Basra in the south, where the oil has been well exploited for years, it's really not known how much oil exactly is underneath Kirkuk because of all the fighting that's gone on over the years. It's really prevented a lot of exploration there. So, there could be really tremendous amounts of oil there. And, of course, we were talking earlier about the Turks and how simply by closing the border they could paralyze the economy of Kurdistan. And so by that measure it becomes very important for the Kurds to have a source of income. And that source of income, they figure, could very well be oil. But then, of course, if Turkey says no, they'll have another problem, which is they will have no way to get their oil out, because right now their pipelines from Kirkuk, they go through Turkey out to the Mediterranean Ocean. Their other options would be to go through Syria, to go through Iran, and of course neither of these countries is very friendly to Kurdish interests either. So if they were able to seize that oil and take control of their Kirkuk, they would have a tremendous problem in terms of their long-term economic health as well.
Now, my understanding has been that a big part of the reason the Sunnis have been fighting this whole time, this insurgency, is really not so much to drive America out, but to keep the American forces there long enough that a strong central state will be created, that they will eventually be able to coup d'etat and run it, because they want to make sure that they get the oil revenue from the north and the south like they used to do in the bad old days under Saddam Hussein. And then the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north say they want either federalism or outright autonomy, and they don't feel they have any reason to share the oil with the Sunni. Is that basically, am I sort of right there or anything?
Well, I think that there may be some elites who think the way that you do, but this is not the way regular people think. Regular people are thinking about their own lives.
Yeah, this is really, I guess I am really talking about the politicians. Because they're the ones with the power, right?
Well, the politicians are not the ones in the power. The Americans are the ones in the power, and that's always important to recognize. Now, there's a new Iraqi army, and you hear a lot about, as they stand up, we'll stand down. But you have to remember that the Iraqi military cannot take a military unit from one part of Baghdad and send it to another part of Baghdad without the express written permission of an American commander. So the Iraqi military is working for the American military. The Iraqi government is being forced by the American government to free the market in terms of the price that Iraqis have to pay for fuel. So you have a tripling of the amount of money charged to Iraqi consumers at the pump when they fill up their cars. And they're like, wait a second, we have the oil. Why is this happening? And in fact, the Iraqi oil minister, Baraloum, resigned over this and said, I refuse to be the oil minister if this is going to be the way things are going. And guess who got into the chair as the oil minister is America's old friend Ahmed Chalabi. So there's a lot of this going on. The important thing to remember is from the perspective of most Iraqis, I think that the only people who really think a lot about the oil are the Kurds we've been talking about. I think they really feel like they desperately need care cooks so that they can have oil to power an independent economy. But I think for most folks, the issue of oil is really secondary. For most folks, you have an issue of dignity. The issue of dignity is not wanting American troops patrolling through their neighborhoods. The issue is, get that foreign military occupier out of my face. I don't like passing 6 or 7 checkpoints on my way to work every day, where there are people manning the checkpoints who don't even understand my language. I don't like the fact that there are battles every night between my neighbors and this foreign military force, and I want all of this to end. I want to be able to send my children to school without sending them to school in an atmosphere of war. I want to be able to have a job where there's 70% unemployment now in Iraq. These are the issues. These are the issues that most people are concerned with. And I think that if we would just take our military and put it back to their bases, that this would have a tremendous impact on peace in Iraq. And that would actually allow people to start thinking about things like the oil, which they can't even fit into their minds right now with all of the terrible daily stuff they have to deal with.
So do you think if the American troops went back to their bases, or even better, came back home, do you think that the country would break up? Or do you think that nationalism and the neighborliness of all these generations in this state of this basically artificial British-created state, do you think they'd hold together, or do you think they'd break apart?
Well, I think that's really none of our business. I mean, I think that you have people living over there. There's 3 main ethnic groups living in a country, and they have to decide for themselves whether they want to live together or live apart. And if they do decide to live apart, they have to be ready to deal with the consequences of that. But who are we to tell them what kind of country they should or shouldn't have? I do think that when we return to our bases, or when we eventually leave, that the situation, at least in the beginning, will be more peaceful than it is now. When I was in Iraq, I interviewed this auto mechanic who was a member of the resistance, and I said, okay, Mr. Auto Mechanic, you're in the resistance, what do you do? And he said, every day, me and my friends go out, we drink tea, we smoke cigarettes, and when the American patrol comes through, we hit them. And if no American patrol comes through, we bomb the police station, because they're collaborators. And you take the American military presence out of this, and this guy is just an auto mechanic. And the vast majority of people who are armed with guns and fighting each other in Iraq are fighting to get the Americans to leave. Now, that doesn't mean that when we do leave, everything's going to be peace and wonderful, because there's a lot of other things going on as well. But why don't we start out by solving the problem that we can actually solve, that we are most part of? I think that this is the main thing.
I saw a recent article you wrote, just what Iraq needs, more prisons. No electricity, no sewage, no water, or not reliably in most places in the country. But you say in your article that all of the reconstruction money from here on out is going into building more prisons?
Well, the Bush administration just asked for $70 billion more for Iraq. And all of that is going to the military. And a reporter asked one of the people who's in charge if they plan to build anything. beyond their bases, if they plan to build anything for the Iraqi people. And they were told, the reporter was told that the only thing they plan to do is build more prison capacity in Iraq. The United States currently holds more than 14,000 people in prison in Iraq as so-called security detainees. So these people are the people who are being held in addition to criminals. They have their own justice system. But the security detainees, they're just arrested for, allegedly being against America, and they get sent to prisons where they get no trial, they get no lawyer, they rarely get to see their family, they're never charged with any crime, and 9 out of 10 of them, according to the International Red Cross, are innocent. And the number of people who are being held by the U.S. military in Abu Ghraib and other prisons as security detainees has actually gone up since the Abu Ghraib scandal first broke 2 years ago. And this is very important because Abu Ghraib has gone from the headlines here in America, but it's not gone if you live in Iraq. It's still there. And we are holding so many people at Abu Ghraib prison that the United States military has had to go tense on the grounds of the prison because we cannot even fit our prisoners in Saddam Hussein's old prison. And we all know that Saddam Hussein was not a very nice man, that he did not have especially small prisons. So this is like advertising for Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, it's worse than the tent city in Arizona. Out there, Iraq's even hotter.
Well, during the summer, it's 130 degrees in Baghdad. And, even for regular Iraqis, trying to sleep without a fan, can make you grouchy. And then if you're living in a tent, it's even worse. If you're living in a tent in an American prison, it's even worse than that. I remember I was interviewing Janice Krupinski, who was the head of Abu Ghraib when the scandal broke. I was just talking to her a few weeks ago. The Americans scapegoated her for everything that went on in Abu Ghraib, and then they kept doing all the same stuff under new commanders. And she said, you hold someone who's innocent for 3 months or a year or 9 months in Abu Ghraib prison in a tent, and you just watch how innocent they are when you release them.
It's interesting. There's been a lot of news stories, and, even Porter Goss testified before the Senate that, yes, what we've done is create a massive recruiting and training ground for Al-Qaeda. How many, do you think it's accurate to say that you have, massive numbers of people joining the international movement against America, or is this is really still mostly just homegrown resistance, your auto mechanic that you interviewed, for example?
Well, even the American military estimates that there's no more than a few thousand of these foreign fighters in Iraq. And to me, the issue is not even how many foreign fighters there are. These foreign fighters would be dead in an instant, killed by their country, killed by the Iraqi people, if the vast majority of Iraqi people did not themselves support attacks on the Americans. So, for example, in the first 6 months of the occupation, we talked about earlier how so many Iraqis were so happy to see Saddam gone. You didn't see any attacks on American soldiers in any meaningful way at that time. Only kind of Ba'athist hardliners were doing it. But now you see daily attacks on Americans, many of them every day. And the reason for that is that there are people like this businessman that I met in Adamiyah, which is a Sunni section of Baghdad. And he told me that he had been watching TV during Colin Powell's infamous presentation to the UN on weapons of mass destruction, praying that Powell had good evidence of WMDs to justify a war, to get rid of Saddam, because his father and his uncle had been killed by Saddam's regime. But when I interviewed him a year into the occupation, he was supporting the resistance, not supporting it by firing a gun, just supporting it in his heart, because 2 of his cousins had been arrested by the Americans without charge and taken to Abu Ghraib prison. And he told me it's the same struggle as under Saddam's regime. Now it's been replaced by the Americans themselves. This is the problem. The problem is this man that I'm talking about, he is so angry at the Americans for destroying his country, he's going to look the other way when there are people in his neighborhood who are firing on the American troops. And so this is the key. How do regular Iraqi people feel about their country being occupied.
And it also brings up the question of what the relationship would be between, for example, the local Sunni Arab population and the foreign fighter jihadist types if America left. George Bush says that Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi would take over the country and create an Islamic caliphate from Spain to Indonesia if we were to leave. And so I wonder, you say that the jihadists are able to do what they're doing because they have the tacit consent of the local population. What happens to that consent if we leave?
Well, I think that what will happen when we leave is that the Iraqi government will have a great deal more legitimacy. In other words, people in Iraq want a strong army. They want a strong army to protect their country against foreign enemies and to keep their streets safe. They want a good police force. But the problem is right now the police and the military are tied up in the occupation. And I believe that one of the things that will happen when we leave is that the Iraqi army will actually get a lot stronger. Now, Bush says we can't leave until the Iraqi army gets stronger, but the problem is nobody will join the Iraqi army in any meaningful way as long as we're there. We have to leave first, and then the Iraqis will start to build their military. I think this is the key. And you may have sectarian violence that breaks out. You may have different groups fighting each other because the Americans have been very adept at pitting the different groups against each other. We haven't really had a chance to talk about that yet, but the Bush administration actually hired a company in 2003 called the Research Triangle Institute that was in charge of picking the Iraqi government. When the Iraqi people actually wanted elections, they hired a company from North Carolina to pick the Iraqi government, and they were told by the Bush administration to pick the Iraqi government solely on the basis of sectarian lines. And so because of that, you may have some sectarian fighting, but all the different groups, all three main ethnicities, are all dead set against these al-Qaeda terrorists, and they'll take care of them.
When you talk about the deliberate pitting of the different ethnicities against each other, it seems also at least unintended consequences of the way the elections were held, that nobody wanted to run as an individual candidate and put their name out there, so everybody had to run on a religious slate. And it was basically set up so that everybody would basically have to go and vote their ethnicity, right? Is that on purpose or part of the same plan you're talking about, or just...
Well, it was what was launched by this initial thing, and then it developed a political culture. But there's another thing that's going on. You have 3 years of no electricity. You have 3 years of no clean drinking water. 3 years is 70% unemployment. 3 years of random detention at Abu Ghraib and other prisons without trial by the occupation forces. 3 years of car bombings and all kinds of other problems breaking out in people's lives. And can they go to their government to help them with this? No. No, they can't, because the police are tied in with the occupation, and people like my auto mechanic friend are attacking the police, and the people are supporting this. So what are folks going to do in this kind of environment? Folks are going to go back to what they know works for them. What always works for them as a last resort, their neighborhood, their family, their mosque, and of course, in the absence of a legitimate police force, people are going to form militias to protect themselves. And sometimes those militias are going to fight each other. And most of the time those militias are going to be based on tribe, or they're going to be based on faith. And this is a problem that the occupation is making worse each and every day.
Yeah, and that's something really to emphasize there, that this isn't something that can be turned around, it doesn't sound like. It sounds like it can only be made worse and worse. The average auto mechanic in Iraq is going to be willing to turn to the Mahdi army for protection.
Yeah.
The more we act
the other thing is, I was in Sadr City in 2003, right after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And the Americans were doing nothing for the people. Nothing at all. On the other hand, the Sadr movement was setting up traffic patrol, garbage duty. The hospitals that they were guarding in Sadr City with their militia were safer than the hospitals that the Americans were guarding in richer parts of Baghdad. I went to one I write about in the book. I went to a Yarmouk hospital, which is in Mansour, which is a fabulously wealthy section of Baghdad. And there was somebody who was in the emergency room. The American troops couldn't tell Somebody went in there to stab the guy to death in the emergency room, even though it was being guarded by American troops, because the American troops have no training in Iraqi culture. They don't speak the language. They have no idea, what's going on. They have no ability to protect anything in any meaningful way. Whereas the Southern militia folks, they're from the neighborhood, so they know, who the good guys and who the bad guys are in that neighborhood. In their hospital, they were guarding Al-Ubaidi Hospital in Sadr City was much safer. So the important thing is, let's not get so ideological that we lose track of what's actually happening on the ground and what actually a militia is. A militia is just a group of people with guns doing security work. You could just as easily call the U.S. military a militia in Iraq.
All this news about Senator Biden and former President of the Council on Foreign Relations, Leslie Gelb, coming out with this report saying that what we need to do is split up, go ahead and deliberately, under American authority, split up Iraq into three on the Yugoslavia model, because apparently it worked so well there, drawing hard lines where these kind of vague borders were before, that they basically want to repeat this. And with what you're saying about the people who were originally assigned to pick the elections, all based on ethnicity and everything, it makes me wonder whether this was in fact the plan the whole time to split Iraq back into the three districts that it was under the Ottoman Empire.
Well, I don't have access to that kind of inside information, but what I will say is that the Americans, when they were going to war, one of the things was, remember, they were working with Chalabi at that time, and they thought that they were going to be able to install Chalabi as prime minister. And even before the war, they had these Iraqi opposition congresses that were held, one of them in London, one of them in northern Iraq under the Kurdish flag, and that these conferences that they held were made up of representatives. And the representatives were one from the Iraqi National Congress, Ahmed Chalabi, one from the Iraqi National Corps, the former Ba'athist turned CIA agent Ayad Alawi, two from the Shia militant side, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and the Hizbullah, the Islamic Preaching Party, and then two from the main Kurdish factions. And so even that was done where the only secular representation possible in these meetings was the CIA agents, basically, Alawi and Chalabi.
Yeah, who fared the worst in the elections in December.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Chalabi, he's now realized, he's got a better sense of political acumen than a lot of the people who went in with the Americans, and he realized that being with the Americans was no longer popular in Iraq, and he kind of switched sides, and he's now buddying up with the Sadr folks and the Islamic militants, the Shiite militants. But Alawi fared the worst, and he's still sticking to his kind of pro-Washington, pro-military line.
There were reports in the last week of border skirmishes between Kurdish forces of some description or another and the Iranians, and accusations that Iran had come as much as 3 miles into Iraq in order to fight the Kurds. And then Iran denied that, and I wonder if you can fill in any details there.
Well, this is not surprising. There are in Iraq Iranian Kurdish militia people who have been existing in bases near the Iranian border since 1991. This is the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, and I visited those bases, and you have constant traffic. This is a long porous border, constant traffic of people fleeing across the border between Iran and Iraq, meeting at the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran military bases in Khoisanjak and north of Erbil, and in Hajj Omran, which is near the Iranian border. And so, one day the Iranian military, and they're operating, together with the Turkish military, which is also stepping up its involvement in the southeast of their country, decided enough of getting shelled. They were sick of getting shelled from Hajj Omran by these Kurdish guerrillas, and so they went and they skirmished with the Kurdish troops.
Do you think this indicates longer-term consequences, further conflict down the road stemming from this, or this is just the kind of thing that happens all the time and isn't likely to spread?
Something. the CIA, God bless the CIA, you think that they'd be all secret, but they're actually not. They have this gigantic base in northern Iraq and Salahadin. And then you have these Kurdish fighters from Iran operating just down the road. I mean, just an hour from the CIA base, you have a Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran base. I interviewed the local commanders there, and they were hoping for more help from the CIA. And now you have all this extra rhetoric coming from Iran and coming from Washington against Iran. And you do the math. There's a lot going on here that we don't yet fully understand. But it just goes without saying that the American government is probably partially involved in some of it.
Well, and we've heard reports from Seymour Hersh and from former General or retired General Sam Gardner that there are, in fact, already American forces operating in Iran, and particularly with an eye toward, just like we talked about in Iraq for the last hour here, almost here, with an eye toward focusing on increasing ethnic tensions and dividing the Iranian people up.
Yeah, but that's not going to work as well in Iran as it does in Iraq, because you do have a sizable Kurdish population there and a sizable percentage of people from Azerbaijan and such, but most of the people living in Iran are Persian, and the biggest breakdowns there are breakdowns that we were all familiar with, the breakdown between rich and poor, the breakdown between religious folks and folks who are more secular, just the same kind of divisions that you have in this country, but of course everyone here feels like they're Americans. So it's not going to be something that they're going to be able to exploit.
And I wanted to end here on a little bit of good news, was that Kamal Karim, the reporter who wrote about the corruption of Masoud Barzani, who was sentenced to 30 years for his criticism, has recently been pardoned, right?
Yeah, well, that is good. Well, it's good news and it's bad news. I mean, here you have this guy, Kamal Karim, who's a Austrian law professor, who's originally from northern Iraq and a Kurd, and he's been very critical of the corruption that's been going on in northern Iraq between Barzani and Talabani, the two Kurdish leaders who, here you have in northern Iraq, you have no American patrols. You have no war, basically. It's very peaceful. You can walk down the street in the middle of the night in Erbil or Sulaymaniyah and not fear for your safety. It's very safe. But on the other hand, 15 years since they got rid of Saddam Hussein, and they only have electricity 3-4 hours a day themselves. But of course, they're getting enormous amounts of money for their share of Iraq's oil revenue all this time. So the question is, why don't they have electricity after 15 years? And it's obviously because the leaders are mostly interested in enriching themselves rather than actually helping their Kurdish brethren. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why they like to wave the bloody shirt of independence, because it is a little bit distracting for folks who are wondering why they don't have a job. So he comes back to Erbil, and within a few days, him returning to the city of his birth, he gets arrested and charged with sedition and defaming the great leader, Masoud Barzani, and they throw him in prison for 30 years. But thanks to an overwhelming campaign of pressure from Kurdish intellectuals, Amnesty International, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and other human rights groups, he was eventually released. Unfortunately, right now, the editors of Hawlati newspaper, which is the only independent weekly newspaper in all of Kurdistan that's not affiliated with the leading factions, are currently on trial themselves. And so, as they say, freedom is a constant struggle.
Aaron Glantz is the author of How America Lost Iraq. It's now out in paperback. He's a reporter for Pacifica Radio and also does freelance stuff and writes for us at antiwar.com.